Can't Breathe, Racial Battle Fatigue, Trauma, and Self-Care, the second in the We Are Not Okay Injustice, Action, and Healing series. Before we get started, I would like to provide some logistical information. Please note that if you are viewing this session on a laptop or computer, you will have viewing options in the upper right corner of your screen. You will be able to select between viewing the active speaker on the full screen, viewing the active speaker and thumbnail views of the rest of the panel, or selecting a grid view to see all speakers on one screen throughout the meeting. If you will be viewing our sign language interpreters, we recommend using the grid view. During this meeting, you will only be able to view and hear our panelists. However, we will be holding a question and answer session. To ask a question, you must select the button at the bottom of your screen that shows a square with a question mark in it. From there, you will be able to send your questions in a chat box. Questions will begin being answered once the question and answer portion begins. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible given the time we have set aside for this meeting. If your question is not answered, please email us at dei@rowan.edu. At this time, I am happy to introduce the Vice President of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Rowan University, Dr. Penny McPherson Myers.
Good afternoon. My name is Penny McPherson Myers, and on behalf of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I would like to welcome you to the We Are Not Okay Injustice, Action, and Healing discussion series, focused on educating, supporting, and providing resources and next steps for the Rowan community and beyond. We are excited that you have joined us for this most important discussion today, I Can't Breathe, Racial Battle Fatigue, Trauma, and Self-Care. I would like to introduce our moderator, Richard Jones, Vice President of Student Engagement.
I Can't Breathe, discussion of racial battle fatigue, trauma, and self-care. I would like to acknowledge Rowan University's president, Dr. Ali Hushman. I would also like to acknowledge members of our Board of Trustees who are present, and they are as follows: Chad Bruner, Chair, Barbara Chamberlain, Member. Today's discussion, entitled I Can't Breathe, discussion of racial battle fatigue, trauma, and self-care, is a part of the We Are Not Okay Injustice, Action, and Healing series. Today's discussion centers the voices of students, faculty, and staff of color in an effort to increase awareness, understanding of racial battle fatigue and trauma. In addition, participants will also explore coping mechanisms that improve their overall well-being and strategies that facilitate collective care. The phrase "I can't breathe" has its origins in the July 2014 death of Eric Garner, who was put into a chokehold by New York City Police Department officers. A video of Garner restrained by multiple officers showed him saying, "I can't breathe," 11 times before losing consciousness. For those who are not familiar with the racial battle fatigue term, Dr. William A. Smith, the researcher who coined the term, describes it as the psychophysiological symptoms from high blood pressure to anxiety, frustration, shock, anger, depression, and withdrawal that people of color may experience living in and navigating historically white spaces. Audience members, please think about that as you take a moment to go to your social media platforms and share comments with the hashtag #WeAreNotOK. Also, if you would like to learn more about the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, please feel free to visit our website, rowan.edu/DEI. And on the website, you will find future discussions as well as recordings of the discussions after they occur. Now that we have a working definition for racial battle fatigue, I would now like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and take about 5 minutes to address I Can't Breathe, discussion of racial battle fatigue, trauma, and self-care from their point of view. And so we're going to start with Dr. Kai Sadler.
Thank you, VP Jones. Good afternoon. My name is Kai Sadler, and I am one of the mental health clinicians within Rowan University's Wellness Center. I would like to take the time first by thanking the DEI leadership team for this opportunity to participate in this discussion, and my fellow panelists for allowing me to share this platform with you. From my perspective, understanding racial battle fatigue, as VP Jones has alluded to, is the emotional and psychological stress response associated with being a person of color and being the repeated target of racism. I believe racial battle fatigue is multidimensional and the byproduct of race-related stress, vicarious racial stress, and race-based trauma. Because none of these terms are in the DSM-5, it can become very convoluted and very complex to determine if the person of color has a clinical diagnosis or diagnoses, or if one exists at all. And may really have to consider looking at a client's symptoms from a cultural context rather than psychopathologizing the person of color. I dare to say to you on today that racial battle fatigue, along with race-related stress and race-based traumatic stress, reflect more of an emotional injury rather than a mental health disorder. Given the current civil unrest and the ongoing race-related incidents, I would like to say to the Black community that racial battle fatigue is real. Race-related stress, as well as race-based traumatic stress, is real. And it is okay to feel pain in this moment. It is okay to feel hurt. It's okay to feel the anger, the outrage, the fear, and even the sadness. And yet it would not be in our best interest to live our lives from this place because of the long-term effects of unresolved trauma that we can most certainly transmit to the next generation, also known as intergenerational trauma. So understanding that there are some instances where assessing for post-traumatic stress disorder or other trauma and related disorders, or even perhaps generalized anxiety disorder may be appropriate because many of the symptoms based on the terms that I just made mention, are consistent with some of the criteria for these other disorders. However, it becomes very paramount that cultural considerations are taken into account when conducting assessments, clinical formulations, providing a diagnosis, and even working with our faculty, our professional staff, and our students of color. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sadler. And next we will hear from Michael. Michael, would you please give us your thoughts on the topic?
Thank you, VP Jones. Good afternoon, everyone. Like you stated, my name is Michael Nash. I'm currently a rising junior at Rowan University, and I'm here representing a student of color at the institution. So essentially, my thoughts on everything have been, I've really been in shock with a lot of things going on. There's been a lot of aha moments for myself. There have been a lot of issues that have, been brought to the light that have been hidden for so long. A student who definitely grew up in a predominantly white town and then going to a predominantly white institution. There have been a lot of disparities that have been exposed to me, and it showed me a lot of different things that I necessarily didn't even know were existent. And I also wanted to say, just thank you to the Division of Equity and Inclusion Department for allowing me to get on here and, voice my opinion and give people that look like myself and my peers a voice and a platform to, have our grievances heard and, ultimately just show us that we can use our voice and, help move change and help better the institution that we go to. So, it just feels good, knowing that there's a group of people that can come out and come together and, have a platform with all these voices and all these different ears that are open and listening to us, just hear us out. So, I definitely think this is a step forward in the right direction. And, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but this is definitely, something that's going to help, us be productive and proactive with this issue that we're facing now.
Thank you, Michael, for those words. And indeed, this is a very emotional topic, but we are very glad that you are here with us to share your feelings. And next, we will hear from Wilson. Wilson, why don't you tell us how you feel about this topic and your response to the title?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Jones, for giving me this opportunity again. Again, I'm really thrilled to be here, and thanks to the Rowan Diversity and Inclusion Office for organizing this, for allowing me to share my perspective and give my own opinion of everything that's going on. To start off, I think we can all agree that in the history of this country, we as Blacks have not enjoyed the same privileges that white people have. And if you're in the audience and you don't agree with this, then you're definitely in the right place. So hopefully at the end of this, you gain some new perspective. I came to the United States a few years back, and I came from Cameroon, West Africa. And I came from a place where I wasn't Black to a place where I was Black. And as soon as I realized that, that was a moment I knew I had to start to adjust. Every day when I walked out of my house, I had to consciously think how people perceive me as a Black man. I had to adjust the way I act. I had to smile more just because I wanted to disarm people from the fact that they're probably think of me as a dangerous Black man. And all these things kind of build this constant anxiety or this constant consciousness subconsciously. And this is things that you think about every day. And this chronic things as it goes on kind of builds up. And let me just give a few examples. And as I'm explaining this, I want you guys to think about why this is happening. Why are people experiencing this? I've been racially profiled many times like I can think of by the police. And just recently, I've lived in South Jersey for about a year now, and I've been pulled over twice by the police, right in my apartment parking lot. And I'll tell you guys, I'll give you guys the incident. So this one time, the cop followed me driving back from school. I'm a student of Rowan SOM, and I'm just driving back from school to my apartment. This guy followed me for about 3 minutes, and as soon as I entered into my parking lot, he followed me and pulled me over. And his reason for pulling me over was I cut off the guy coming in opposite traffic. Okay. And he said, I didn't pull you over because you were speeding. And the other time, the guy followed me in the parking lot, said, after tailing me for about 5 minutes, he said, when you made it right, your tail light was out. And these are the kind of things I would go through. Every time I see a cop car, I get this fright. I get this anxiousness within me. And again, these are the things that I deal with every day. And this doesn't just exist in the civil society, in the medical society as well, in the medical practices, this is clearly been happening. Black people are dying of COVID-19 3 times the rate at which white people are. Black women have an infant mortality rate of 2 times more than non-Hispanic white women. And why is this? I'm challenging everyone to question, why is this happening? It is because of the chronic socioeconomic disenfranchisement of Black communities. This builds up trauma over time that causes epigenetic changes that change how our inside is. And when a Black kid is born, you're already placed at a disadvantage with all these changes. Now I want to challenge you guys, starting with the administration of Rowan and Rowan SOM. We can do better. We can start now, use this wave to do better. In my class of about 206 students, there are about 12 Black students, which is about 5%. They're training us to be doctors in South Jersey, but that is nearly not representative of the 12% Black population in South Jersey. Ask yourself, why is that? What can I do to make that better? To my peers, to all the students out there, I want you guys to identify your implicit bias. To those who are training, all the doctors and the residents, think about when you walk into a patient's room, and you see somebody that doesn't look like you, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Take a step back and evaluate yourself think about your implicit bias. What did I think about that patient when I first saw? And if it was something that was racially built prejudice, then check that and say, no, that's not the way to think. And so everyone
Wilson, let me interrupt you for a quick second. For those of us that are not familiar with the term epigenetics, could you give us a really brief explanation of what that term means?
Sure. So epigenetic changes are changes in the structural form of your DNA that doesn't necessarily lead to a mutation or harmful deletion. So this is just changes that is going to affect certain genes, but not in a bad way. Okay, let me say this again. So there's certain mutations that can cause deletions, or that can cause the whole form of a protein to change. These mutations don't do that. They just affect a different way of the expression of the gene. I don't know if that's clear enough. I think your mic is off.
And thank you for your comments. And thank you for that explanation. And now we will hear from Rob Simmons. Rob, would you tell us about your response to this particular topic and your feelings associated with it?
Certainly. And I want to echo a lot of the gratitude that we've gotten so far. Thank you to DEI and the other folks on our network who have made this possible. So I'm sort of also referencing the same research, by the Smith-Allen, Danley group from 2007 as I enter this conversation. So here's some of my considerations about what's happening, what's going on for folks who are, in my mind, I should speak more specifically. So I'm thinking a lot about just generally speaking, for the majority of folks that live or work on a campus, and folks of students of color, students in general, staff in general, we experience campus, a college campus in three ways. It's that social aspect, the academic aspect, and then that public space. And that's a lot of what, Smith talks about in that research. I wanted to also add to that for institutions, that like Rowan share space with local towns or cities. For me, there's like this fourth dimension. There's this, that local dimension where we're also experiencing the social, academic, and public space of the areas that sort of surround where we live or where we work. So think for folks who are in this with us today, I want you to think a little bit about your institution's landscape, your institution, your business, your companies, sort of in your institution's history and relationship with discrimination, and really as it relates to today's conversation, racism. So personally speaking, I've been called the N-word as a car sped past, on campus. And I've also been stopped on campus by town police officers and being asked, where are you going? And these are only two of a number of times that I've experienced this racial discrimination on a college campus. And a little bit about, sort of how Dr. Carlson mentioned, racial battle fatigue is this body's response. I mean, it's in my brain, it's in my body, of how I experience these traumatic racist incidents that occur on our campuses in the neighboring towns. I also like to say really that racial battle fatigue is itself a form of trauma, not simply a response to all the things that are happening to us. So in some senses, we are doubly, if not triply, in ways, a triple response to trauma, experiencing trauma in a number of ways, all overlaid, sort of in these really complicated ways. Our institutions ask us, that is students, staff of color, they might go, through uncaught breath, please tell us what you need to breathe. Uncaught breath. What do you need to breathe? I think it is additionally traumatizing to see our institutions respond to injustices with, letters of support and allyship to our campuses, often missing any clear detail about the policies or practices that they can implement to dismantle racism, or more promises of recruitment or other forms of increasing visibility on campus. For me, in this, as I think about this conversation and sort of the cycle of racial battle fatigue, for me, I just feel these approaches place the responsibility of equity and inclusion on folks of color. It's almost as if saying that, visibility of folks of color dismantles racism and white supremacy on college campuses. And I wanted to close with a question I've been encouraged with this question from an essay of Dr. King. And I really ask this question to our institutions, and really in terms of how we think about how we shift what is happening in our nation, on our campuses. What needs to be implemented? What needs to change? What do we need to do so that folks of color are not continuing to integrate themselves into a burning house? Thank you.
VP Jones, I believe you're muted.
Yeah, so Mary, thank you, Rob, for that passionate response once again. And forgive me, audience members, for being muted. I think I got caught up in Rob's response. But Rob, once again, thank you. And Marie-Ange, why don't you tell us about how you respond to our topic and your feelings that are associated with our topic for today?
Thank you, VP Jones, and thank you to Rowan Diversity team for putting this forum together and having me here today. I'm a second-year medical student at Cooper Medical School and have definitely been feeling the impact of racial battle fatigue the past couple of weeks, especially with a media saturated with images of violence against Black bodies. I'm an avid consumer of podcasts, and there's one episode in particular that has always stayed with me. They were talking about how infants born to Black mothers were twice as likely to die than infants born to white mothers. And when they disaggregated the data and looked at specifically babies born to foreign-born Black mothers versus white mothers, they found that the Black-white disparity between infant mortality rates disappeared. However, the daughters of Black immigrants who grew up in the US and went on to have infants, they had similar outcomes to other Black American mothers. So in just one generation, the American Black-white disparity manifested. And so when I think about racial battle fatigue and trauma, I think about this episode because it so perfectly portrays how distressing it is to experience Blackness in America, which is why it's so important to practice self-care and invest in your own happiness as a Black person to combat the stresses of being Black in America. And in my life, especially the past couple of weeks, a lot of that has been around building really strong support systems, knowing the community members that I can go to who understand what I'm going to, who I don't necessarily have to educate. And I think it's really important, like you were saying, Rob, that institutions don't continue to overburden the few people of color that they have. So I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion with everybody and learning more about how to prioritize Black joy as much as Black lives. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, for that marvelous introduction. All some wonderful things for us to start to think about as we have this conversation. I would also like to take this time to really recognize the fact that our Board of Trustees have come out to support this conversation because it is important and meaningful to the university. And I would like to recognize the fact that another Board of Trustees member has joined us, Lita Abel. Thank you for coming aboard and joining us in this conversation. So panelists, so here we go. Before we go on into our conversations, right? I would like to have you kind of talk about this whole idea of trauma and racial fatigue, right? How do I know if I'm a person of color on a campus? How do I know if I am suffering from racial battle fatigue? What are some of the signs that might manifest for me beyond the definition provided? Dr. Kai, would you like to start with that one?
Yes. So I think, as I made mention in my beginning, at the beginning of my introduction, that racial battle fatigue can become so complex where it can be very difficult to identify the symptoms. So one particular symptom that actually comes to mind in terms of avoidant responses So for example, an individual may find themselves avoiding people. So whether that could be the police, it could be avoiding going into the tutoring center or seeking out other academic supports in the form of success coaching because of this mistrust, this inherent mistrust of white people. You may also see the avoidance even in the form of places. So whether there's particular neighborhoods that an individual is acutely aware that is predominantly white, he or she or they may do their very best to avoid going into certain neighborhoods. I also even think about conversations. So may not even want to have dialogue such as what we're discussing pertaining to cross-race relationships and experiences. I also think it can even manifest in the form of, what's referred to as intrusions. So having recurrent thoughts of events that are race-based. So whether that is, reliving the experience in the form of flashbacks or memories or dreams, and this can be very pronounced, particularly around anniversary dates. So I definitely would be really intrigued in terms of how individuals will be responding around this time next year. Arousal. So there's a lot of different ways in which one can experience racial battle fatigue. I think one aspect that isn't necessarily highlighted as much in racial battle fatigue is like this sense of altered cognitions. And what I mean by that is where an individual can begin to develop a negative worldview towards others. So this development of I don't trust people, and really to even amplify that statement, individuals may find themselves saying, I don't trust white people. I don't trust the police, again, as a result of the ongoing racial encounters that an individual has experienced. So there are just some of the symptoms I would say one could be aware of that could most certainly be connected to an individual potentially experience, again, not just the racial battle fatigue, but also the race traumatic stress that Dr. Robert Carter coined from Columbia University. So I think it's really important for us to understand that there's one thing related to trauma, and there's also, as a result of particular events that an individual has experienced that are not or that isn't race-based. So I think that's something to really amplify in terms of when we think about trauma and all of the different ways that it can be, experienced.
So I would like to direct this question to the students. So if one of the experiences that can manifest from these feelings is the mistrust of white people or the police, right? How does that impact you navigating Rowan University's campus?
So I'll chime in on that part. So I essentially think that it takes on a beast of its own, right? It creates this almost this culture within our community, like we know, okay, we're not going to go there, or we know where to go. We know how to move and how to navigate, like you said, certain areas of the campus. And it almost is like it's almost like a part of an orientation sense when you get there. When you start to get in with the right crowd and you start to meet people that look like yourself, there are certain things that have become normalized behavior on campus so that we understand, how to prevent ourselves from being hurt or putting ourselves in harm's way. And it's something that shouldn't be that way, but it's just the way it is. I know being a junior, like my freshman year coming in, getting involved more in meeting certain people. There were certain places and certain organizations, they would tell me, okay, this is what they're known for. And it's almost very unsettling knowing that that exists there, but it's something that is almost like ingrained in the university at this point. So you know, there needs to be a solution to it, but it's definitely present there, and it's taking on a world of its own in a sense. So yeah.
So Michael, can you, if you feel comfortable,
Mhm.
can you provide us some examples of some places that, you know, you may have avoided because you did not want to experience those feelings?
So, around the time where syllabus week and certain events are going on, and it's college, so there's parties, there's all types of things going on. So there's certain houses or certain blocks or certain areas that you may avoid because of the high police presence. And me myself, my friends look like me. So when we're in certain areas, we know, okay, when we're in these areas, we have to be on our best behavior. We have to walk a certain way. We can't, like Wilson alluded to earlier, you don't wear your hood. Make sure your hands are visible. Make sure there are certain rules that we have to follow because we don't want to cause a commotion, or we don't want to, make ourselves a target. And, that was something that definitely was very traumatic for myself because, like I said, I come from a community where racism is very hidden, but it's not to a point where I feel uncomfortable going to certain places. And in Glassboro, there are certain niches and communities that, you just stare away from just because of the stigma that's been created around them. So yeah, it's all around. It's very present and prevalent, throughout Glassboro in general.
Right. Thank you for that response. Marie-Ange, could you also answer that question as a medical student? Have you seen that manifest itself in any particular ways with yourself or maybe even with your peers? This mistrust of white people or maybe the mistrust of police officers?
I think, at least for me, I, because a lot of times people who hold racist views, it's not very overt, right? And so for me, it's almost like I have to wait to see like what someone says. Like, oh, like, do they think I don't belong to being in this space? Because there are so few medical students. And so I feel like I have to be excel at everything, so that puts even more pressure on myself as a person of color, or that I have to like speak for the whole Black population. So I'm a student, but I'm also like advocating for Black community all the time. So it's not necessarily like mistrust, but it's just like that added stress on yourself. Yeah.
And I'm going to read it now. How can systems of healthcare, education, and public safety have accountability measures, whistleblower, for example, that actually hold individuals that show bias be approached while notifying management, administration to take next steps to make their organizations better? Rob, could you tackle that one for us?
I can try. It's a very robust question. The first thing that comes to my mind is, oftentimes, either in these sort of town gown communities, even in our campuses where we are collaborating or working with organizations on Rowan's campus and around us, we're collaborating with them. So I think it's the job of administrators, it is the job of our senior leaders to really hold healthcare systems, public safety systems, and organizations accountable to the beliefs, to the values that we hold for our students on campus. If we say we're about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we define what that looks like for our community, and it's our call, if you will, and the duty of these folks who want to collaborate with us to provide our students with the best possible service that is also safe and equitable as well.
Thank you. So Wilson, you are a medical student. Is there any particular ways that you would recommend that healthcare might hold people accountable for the disparities or the injustices that occur?
Yes, thank you. That is a very broad question, but yes, there's definitely ways that the healthcare can hold people accountable. I think it really starts with the educational level. The training that we're going through now lays a foundation for how we're going to be or how we're going to act when we become doctors. And our faculty now, has that task to teach us empathy, to teach us compassion at a bare minimum, to be able to be doctors that can understand and connect with humans at a very intimate level. And in terms of holding doctors accountable, I think that is not really done well. I really haven't done enough research in that part, but I'm pretty sure there are third-party bodies that you can file complaints to, and that could be they could be held accountable.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Before we move on to our next question, is there anyone else that would like to add to the dialogue on this particular question?
Yes, VP Jones. Speaking from the perspective as it pertains to mental health professionals, I really think that it is very, very, very paramount for our mental health professionals when they are working with a person of color to really make sure that during clinical assessments that they're exploring the client's experiences with racial discrimination and how it has been a source of pain, how it's been a source of hurt, humiliation, shame, or even perhaps strength. Because I think sometimes it's, as we've been, exposed to over the last couple of weeks and even the years, that it's a taboo topic, not just even publicly, but just even within the therapeutic room, that sometimes it's not a conversation that is brought up. I think is really important for, clinicians to look at the client's racial encounters and how that may integrate with the presenting problem. So the individual, again, based on the first question that you asked, may not even recognize that they are experiencing, the psychological distress as well as the physiological distress, the emotional experiences related to trauma. So just even the difficulty of recognizing that, hey, that was an emotional injury that I sustained as a result of these traumatic events. I think it's also important to look at whether it's clinically or even outside of a clinical framework, the racial composition and the power differential between the client and the therapist, faculty and student, as well as supervisor and supervisee. So I think that it being very essential for us to be able to have these conversations, whether it's, again, clinically or even outside of the therapeutic room.
So I've had conversations where I've had friends, colleagues, family members who have approached, a healthcare provider, an educator, with, feelings of fatigue or trauma, and they were met with a very dismissive response, right? How might one manage an educator, a healthcare provider, or maybe even a police officer who issues a dismissive response, not acknowledging your feelings or your experiences?
I think just even from what you shared, hopefully there's enough ego strength, where the individual has the wherewithal to be able to put voice to that experience, that I've shared something that is very personal to me. And I feel as though that it was very, dismissive. I think, I feel as if it was overlooked, and that was very hurtful to me. So how can we commit together for, me to be heard and for me to be understood? So I think it puts the person of color in a position of hopefully feeling empowered and not internalizing the discriminatory acts or stress responses that are so easy for us to ignore and to dismiss, that then begins to further perpetuate these emotional experiences that are linked to anger and rage. So I would definitely challenge the individual to speak up in terms of what they are experiencing rather than suppressing what they're going through.
All right. So for those people who don't have the skills, so what we do know is that, speaking up is a learned behavior, right? So what could institutions, healthcare, universities do besides the whistleblower policy, or have a whistleblower policy to empower those who don't feel comfortable, speaking up, right? Because what hangs in the balance for a lot of people is that you might not get the health care that you need, right? Or maybe you might get looked at unfairly, by a supervisor, or maybe you might get overlooked for that promotion. So what are some mechanisms that, institutions can put in place to empower the person who does not have the voice to speak up?
So I know that this is a very provocative statement, and I'm willing to share that it does take practice. And my mind goes to the work of Dr. Howard Stevenson from the University of Pennsylvania, and a lot of his work focuses on racial literacy. So whether you identify as a person of color or not, and being in a position to have dialogue, what he refers to as racial storytelling, or what he may refer, or what he does refer to as healthy comebacks. So these healthy comebacks are things that individuals, particularly people of color, can practice when they are faced with an in-person encounter that is that has a discriminatory tone. So that can even be as simple as, excuse me, I reject your rejection of me. And again, it takes time, but my mind definitely goes to the storytelling, as well as the healthy comebacks. In his work, he also speaks to what I refer to as racial mindfulness. So with this racial mindfulness, it is a stress management response where an individual will calculate. So he basically says that this ought to be done in less than a minute, but again, that's where the practice comes in, where they calculate on a scale from 1 to 10, how stressed are you in this particular moment? Then the individual moves to locate. So with the location, where in your body do you feel, the stress? Okay, I feel the stress in my heart. I feel it in my throat. And then having this communication where there's this internal dialogue. Okay, it could be either positive or negative. What do I need to do in this particular moment, as well as including the deep breathing, as well as the individuals going through this. So I know that, that is a lot, but I believe again that it, puts us in a position to increase our assertiveness, this sense of empowerment, because our minds are very prone to be racing when we have these racial encounters, because they're unexpected. It's not anything that one usually anticipates. And when it happens, these are some of the things in terms of his work that he indicates is very helpful.
Thank you. So Michael, I want to ask you a question as an undergraduate student, right? Have you ever had any experience? Have you ever had any experience, or maybe your friends? I know that you are part of a men's group on campus. Have you ever had any experience where you felt powerless to talk about a racial issue, or maybe your friends were struggling with something? Do you have any stories that you could share with us about those times in which you or maybe your friends may have had those types of experiences, and how did they deal with them?
So yeah, I definitely think it's something that's very, very prevalent on campus. A lot of times I feel as though like people are uncomfortable. And as African Americans, we feel as though like we don't have power because of that. And I think the goal now moving forward should really be, realizing like being unapologetically Black and that we go to the school too, and that we attend this institution as well, and that we should definitely be able to voice how we feel about those issues. And I guess some stories I would have to say, I kind of seen to go a little bit off what you're kind of saying. One thing that I'm really big on is like education, right? And like we talk about this whole thing within equality and different things, and there's really, I believe, an issue at Rowan University in terms of meeting students where they're at. And I have a lot of friends that come from different areas of New Jersey, whether it be Newark or Orange or a Morristown or a Marlton, which are, two completely different educational systems. And when they come to Rowan, they feel as though they're not being appreciated or they're not being met where they are. And what I mean by that is that I think that we need to preach more equity rather than equality, because students, can't necessarily control what they're learning or the resources that they're receiving in the institutions that they're coming from. And when we're addressing those issues, I feel as though university officials and people in power are uncomfortable to discuss that, and so are Black students, because they feel ashamed that they're behind, or they feel as though they can't speak up because of everything seems to already be established, and you don't want to seem as though you're lacking in some area. And I think that that's definitely a big issue, and the reason why Black students don't necessarily voice their opinion. And so, like I said, we're not going to say no names, but I have friends that have said, well, I feel as though I want to go to student center, but I can't relate, or I don't want to seem as though they asked me a question and I can't answer the question and my best answer because I lack the prior knowledge and the prerequisites to answer that question. So I feel as though it creates a high level of uncomfortability on campus, and ultimately leads to, unfortunately, a lot of students, leaving university and going to other places, etc.
Right. And I want to open this question up to Wilson or Marie-Ange as well. So has there been any situations in which maybe a friend of yours came back and they talked about a particular experience that they had with a faculty member that made them feel less than, all right, or that caused them some type of trauma, anxiety, or frustration? Can one of you all share an example of that? So I think that a lot of students probably feel inadequate when they first come to college, right? But have there been times that your peers said, I was sitting in the classroom and this occurred, and you know what? It didn't feel right. Can someone speak to that?
Yeah, I'll take this one, VP Jones. Yes, I'll say at Rowan SOM. I happen to be the curriculum representative for our class, so I definitely hear a lot of things from my peers. And they've come to me and said so many times, more than once, twice, that they've had some uncomfortable experiences, and they've taken it up to the administration, and it pretty much just fell on deaf ears, and nothing was done. Promises were made, but nothing else was happening. Um, I think this is a really big issue for a school, for our school that really prides itself in diversity, because we really want to make our students feel comfortable. We want to make everybody out there feel like they belong. And if someone with a legitimate complaint forwards it up and nothing is done, that makes you feel really worthless. And that's just a higher hope that we're already medical students doing a lot of stress from like academics, and that just adds to the stress that we have to go through again. I think it's really, we should really stop saying we don't see color and see color, because in fact our color does really affect us in so many ways.
Mhm. So Marie-Ange, I want you to get an opportunity to talk about maybe a personal experience or maybe an experience that maybe a friend of yours may have had, a colleague may have had. But I do want to not lose the idea centered around color, and how does your color impact the way you navigate these spaces? Mary?
Yeah, I do think at Cooper Medical School they've been pretty good about responding to students who've had uncomfortable experiences with other faculty members. I think it's been more difficult when students get into the clinical setting in hospitals or outpatient and working with physicians, especially because medicine is so hierarchical. And so a few people have definitely said that they are uncomfortable bringing up a complaint because it will negatively affect their evaluation, which will then affect their ability to get into a residency program. So I think in terms of that, there's a lot of improvement that can be done. I don't know if it's similar at Rowan SOM, but it seems like once people get outside of the school setting, it just becomes increasingly harder to voice any kind of concern, whether that's related to race, gender, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Michael, from an undergraduate experience. So one of the things that we know about being an undergraduate is that you're growing and you're developing and you're learning different skills. Have you ever had, or maybe some of your peers had a complaint, a specific complaint, right? That they were concerned about that didn't get addressed? And you felt like maybe it had something to do with race, or maybe a decision was made by the university, right? That was made and it felt racially tinged, and it caused you and your peers, some emotional feelings.
Not off the top of my head, but I know, there's a lot of different situations buzzing around campus, like always, situations that people have, run into. But I guess
why don't you give us an example of some of these situations?
So, there was a situation this past semester. A friend of mine got into, something with a virtual signing, with the whole COVID-19 situation and the whole, classes being online. And he got into a little bit of a debacle over him virtually signing in for someone else. And in my opinion, I believe that, the extent that this teacher was using and the power that they were using and the officials they were trying to contact, they were doing this essentially because of the color of his skin. And even though that professor may not have seen it that way, there was an underlying, motive behind that. Because I'm sure there were several other students involved in this incident, but it seemed as though this professor made it their ultimate goal to, derail this particular student from what they were doing. And I feel as though those issues sometimes aren't addressed. I'm sure they probably, go to the higher ups and, they think nothing of it, because I'm sure when, when the paperwork hits the files and different things, you don't see race, or you don't see the different, extents of the issue, you just see the name. And I feel as though we need to, address that, because there are incidents on campus that are, racially charged. And we need to make sure that we're addressing those issues, because in the end, we're ultimately, losing students and losing future leaders, and people begin to feel uncomfortable about, the way that they're being taught and the different things. It's almost like you're walking on eggshells in the classroom. And like you said, you should feel as though, like, I can go to my professor and ask him about an internship opportunity, or I can do this. And at the end of the day, we just want, the classroom to essentially just be an extension of what we want in this world, which is, equality, equity, and those different things. And that's not really being met right now.
I tell you, Michael, we definitely don't want to lose students, and we don't want to lose leaders such as yourself and future prominent citizens of the world. So what are some recommendations that you might give the university? Or Marie or Wilson, what are some recommendations that you might give the university in order to address these concerns that students have, in order that they might thrive and feel supported and feel as though Rowan really is their home away from home? Marie, why don't you, Marie, you can answer that one. Michael, you can go ahead.
Okay. Michael, do you want to go?
Oh no, you can go. You can go.
Okay. Yeah. One thing that I think is really important is, and I think Wilson, you were alluding to this, not treating all students the same, right? Because students of color will be experiencing a lot of different stressors than a white student, for example. I know at Cooper, we have like scheduled check-ins with a resource person at the school, and she probably has the same list of questions for every student, regardless of race. And I think this would be a really good opportunity to ask students of color, Black students, if they've had any racially tense experiences at school, so that the onus of speaking up isn't put on the student. Like you were saying, VP Jones, it is, for some people, it is hard to bring those concerns up. And so if that was already like automatically put into the system, I think that that's one thing. Yeah, that's one thing I can think off of the top of my head.
What about some recommendations, Wilson, that that you might give the university in order to, address these complaints, or, to make sure that students' voices are heard regarding these issues of race?
Just well, going off what Marie-Ange said, it's really seeing color, seeing that we as Blacks we're not going through the same thing like our peers are going through. At Rowan SOM, I don't really feel like we had that compared to what Marie-Ange was saying they have a Cooper. It's something that we might utilize, or I feel like it might be beneficial to have at Rowan SOM. And I also think having a representative population of Black medical students too, it's key, because we, like I mentioned earlier, we are only about 5% or 6% of our class, and while the population we're training to serve, it's about 12% in South Jersey, and that is not nearly representative. So I feel like, having, more people feels like, you can have a support system over there. More people will look like you can kind of share and, talk to your experience. And I feel like just talking to someone who can relate actually does help. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you. Thank you, Wilson. What about you, Mike? What are some recommendations? What are some solutions or strategies?
Kind of the same thing that's already been said. Essentially just, realizing, you have to learn to see us and our color in the different things that we go through in our life. I flash back to when Trayvon Martin was killed. That was probably my first, real moment realizing, like, okay, this is what it's like to be Black in America. And I'm sorry about that, if you guys can hear that. Being Black in America, and, I'm expected to go to school. Can you still hear that?
Yeah, just a little bit. Right. So I tell you what, yeah, you want to work on that one for a little bit, and I'll come back to you. Okay.
Okay.
All right. I'll come back to you. Rob, if a student wants to come to you with some of these concerns, how might you advise the student?
Okay. So, and this is almost connected to a question that I saw earlier it's connected really about how we support students, or where are the spaces for Black students in particular to build relationships with other students and with Rowan community staff, faculty. I think that was the gist of that question. So for me, as the assistant director of mentoring, I run the Dr. Harley Flack mentoring program on campus. Historically, we've been a program that really supports students of color who come to campus that might identify as, a low income and or first gen student on campus. So my front line really is letting the student know, one, that myself, as well as the office that I'm housed in, that is the Office of Social Justice, Inclusion, and Conflict Resolution, that we are at the front line. We are their support. We are, as administrators in that office, there to listen to them and to support them. And then second, to connect them with other students and a community on campus, and to be in order to be supported around their experiences on campus. We are also, part of a larger network where we include offices and administrators who run wonderful programs like the Rowan Thrive Initiative. Wonderful folks at the Wellness Center as well. So my second go-to, but I also train my peer mentors to do as well, is to introduce to our students who have these questions things like the bias report system that's online, help our students know where the Wellness Center is, and to explain to them, and in some sort of an abridged version of what that center is there to do, what that service is for, and what it's intended to provide. I mean, there are obviously a number of other concerns that students may have. I think some folks also mentioned, I think, this question around trauma itself. And again, back to my opening statement, I think it's important to name that if I've gone through a traumatic event, and I said also, I'm also being asked to do this thing while experiencing this trauma. And if I'm told we don't have enough availability for you, we have to push your time back, that too can also feel traumatic. So I also want to name that it is really important that, for me, when I think about the administrators in my office, the senior level administrators that really lead the vision that I fall under in DEI, is that we have a protocol in place that, one, connects our students who have questions or challenges to us. Second, to a community of students who might have some advice, some pieces of sound advice about how you not only have to, I have to deal with this trauma and be a student and do my extracurriculars. I can't give you professional information or feedback, but as a student, I also did it this way. And so they may also have,
play for a second, right? Let's role play. Say you're giving this wonderful advice to the student, and the student comes back to you, and the student says, man, I've had my friends, fill out those reports, and I've had my friends talk to professors, and, and I've had my friends go to the counseling center, and you know what? No one ever got back with me, man. I'm not doing this. I'm not going to participate, right? How would you encourage that student, right? And what would your response be to that student?
And I've had to talk about that a number of times, and it is a difficult place to be in. I think because, again, this is where back to my opening statement, we really have to hold, if we have systems in place as an institution, as the administrators of DEI, SJICR, our senior leaders, we really have to think about those challenges themselves. We cannot make our students responsible to deal with the fact that that's not happening. So my response to my students should not be, it's unfortunate to say, folks are busy. We have a ratio that's, this unrealistic ratio of, one counselor to every 54 students or whatever that number is, and that you have to just wait in line or be triaged. But certainly that answer is going to it's going to depend on the specific needs of that student at that time. But again, for me, my front line is to be a support to that student. Second, to connect them to a community of folks that in the interim, they can be seen and understood and sort of validated and having expressing those feelings. I think a hard thing for me was being at a PWI and saying these things are happening and making the choice to say them in the classroom, a social justice course with all white students, and being completely invalidated in that moment. And I think what's important about how we support our students is that when we are the front line, and we also have to respect our lines of communication, because I'm not a certified counselor, or licensed to provide a certain levels of sort of service, it is to provide our students with communities that validate them and see them until they get the professional services that we have promised them in the first place. And that was an unapologetic plug for the Dr. Harley Flack Mentoring Program. So we have students here. Please feel free to reach out, because we are here with you. We are here for you, 100%.
All right. So so we've definitely talked a lot about trauma. We've talked about racial battle fatigue. Let's talk about self-care, right? Let's talk about how do we respond to these incidents and take care of ourselves and maybe each other, right? Would somebody like to start? Let's start with Mike. Mike, are you back with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, Mike, tell me what ways do you take care of yourself and how do you practice self-care when you're feeling the anxiety and frustration of maybe the moment that we're in right now, or maybe some of the racial issues that you have to navigate on campus? Tell us how you take care of yourself.
Yep. So my number one thing I would say is I like to call it being able to find my peace, find my safe zone, I like to call it, my area where I can, be myself and go uninterrupted and just be able to disconnect myself, I like to say, from the world in a sense. And whether it's, reading a book, for me it's like I in my bio I said I started, having this podcast to, try to help people who are, going through different things, just have that, whether it's an hour, 2 hours, 30 minutes out of your day where you can, disconnect yourself from social media. Because as we know, like what you're feeding your brain, especially now, is it's so important. It can really affect, your energy and the way that your mood, fluctuates throughout the day. And I feel like ultimately you just have to be able to find that, that safe space for yourself and that inner peace, whether, like I said, reading, whatever it may be. I know like one thing Mocha's been trying to do is we've been trying to, do group FaceTimes during the week so that, guys can come on and, we can talk and we can joke and we can kind of, for a second, even if it's only for a little bit, be ourselves and not have to worry about the threats of the outside world. So, the one thing that I would definitely want to emphasize is, to anyone listening is find your peace and find that moment where you can, just disband yourself, tell your friends, I'm doing my own thing right now and just, be yourself and have your safe space essentially.
Right. And it also sounds like you're saying find a community that you can respond and connect with as well.
Yep.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What about Marie-Ange? What about you? Tell us how you, as a student in medical school, Wilson, we'll get to you as well. How do you take care of yourself and how do you practice self-care?
Yeah, I think the first thing is it's important to not feel like you're alone experiencing everything. So again, like that community, knowing like having friends that I can vent to is really important. Secondly, nourishing my soul. So for me, that's like getting outside and just like away from everything. And then recently, just like being on social media and being very engaged in advocacy has been great, but also it's very draining. So knowing myself and knowing when I'm overwhelmed and when I, need to take a step back and not feeling guilty about it and knowing that, I'm preserving my sanity, and when I'm able to, I can go back and into the fight. Yeah.
All right. Well, we need you because we need you to graduate and become a doctor so that you can take care of all of us, okay?
For sure.
All right. All right. Wilson, what about you? How do you what does self-care mean to you and how do you practice self-care?
Yeah, I think Michael and Marie-Ange already kind of touched on a lot of that, so I'm just going to echo that. I think Marie-Ange knows this, but medical school is like a constant marathon, and in one way or another, you have to learn self-care. You have to learn to take care of yourself and your mental health. And for me, my number one is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My number one is, praying. My recommendation to every other person is, whatever you believe in, it's whatever it could be God, whatever, if you believe in any other higher power, look up to that in times of stress, look up to that in times when you're not okay, and just ask to be, to be okay. And for me, that has really helped me in my 1 year of medical school so far. And then number two, which my colleagues already kind of echoed on, it's finding that community. And I cannot emphasize how much important this is. Finding that community where you can just vent and laugh. just get away from the normal world, and because they get you, and you get them, and that is really, 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 really healthy. It could be your family, your loved ones, your friends, it could be your pet, whatever helps you find that safe zone, or that zen. And then lastly, I would say do what you love. For me, it's basketball. Unfortunately, basketball is no more, and I can't go to the park. So now I picked up running, and now I go for runs every day. I've never run in my life, but just to kind of stay sane. So that's what I recommend.
Well, thank you. So we've heard some really good recommendations from, finding community, just finding a place where you can just kind of be by yourself and concentrate on your thoughts. Prayer is a useful tool for a lot of people. Dr. Kai Sadler, from a mental health perspective, what is a good definition for self-care, and what are some tips that you might, give a client that comes to see you who's dealing with racial battle fatigue or trauma? How would you advise them to take care of themselves?
Sure. Thank you, VP Jones. So I think when working particularly with a student of color that identifies as Black, I most certainly look at self-care through the lens of soul care, because that, again, I think language is really important, and I found that it really resonates with students when I refer to it as soul care. So looking at the total self, the total being, and overall really just speaking to wellness and what the individual feels as though that he, she, or they need to engage in to experience and promote wellness, which can be collectively or individually. So I think that's really important. Some other things, just even from a cultural context, within the Black community, I also think about altars. So with the term altars, as we know within our culture, that there are activities and things that we can do as a visual reminder, whether that's a person choosing to connect with their ancestry, or as Wilson mentioned, as far as God or other worship experiences that provide a sense of grounding and reconnection to one's lineage or purpose. So I think that definitely is important, because when we think about soul care, making sure that it's even unique and in alignment with the person's race as well as their ethnicity. I think also what's really, really paramount for the Black community is acknowledging that the emotion exists and being able to put voice to the experience, and being able to label the emotion, because each of us respond to trauma differently. And I would dare not say that every person of color who has experienced or witnessed trauma will necessarily have a mental health disorder, because each of us have different internal resources that help us to cope and manage with fear and stress differently. Also, what comes to mind is temporarily avoiding our exposure to social media posts or the news, or even having conversations, or not having conversations, I should say, related to police brutality. So just knowing when to unplug, because that most certainly can help us regulate our emotions. And one last point that I would make that I think is really essential is having open and honest conversations about what one is experiencing. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, when we begin to find ourselves internalizing the negative feelings, that it only perpetuates and exacerbates and magnify the anger and the rage and the anxiety. So, really being able to find someone that you can have an open and honest conversation about what one is experiencing. So I'll stop there. There's other things that are coming to mind, but I'll stop there.
recently that that people of color don't really take advantage of. And so this is a really good opportunity to promote self-care through mental health care, right?
Absolutely. And I think, not think, I know that's one of the reasons that in 2018, You Good Fam started at the university, which stands for Fostering and Advancing in Mental Health, Fostering and Advancing Mental Health and Emotional Well-Being, specifically for our students of color, because recognizing that all of us have been socialized in different and various ways. And as it pertains to the Black community, when we think about help-seeking behaviors, help-seeking attitudes, that there is, the research speaks to, an underutilization of mental health services. So being able to offer You Good Fam dialogues in collaboration with the Office of Social Justice is another way in which we've been very intentional in caring, having that soul care for our students. So definitely it is a prime time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So so now is the time that we start to wind down our panel discussion. And I just want to say that this has really been really good food for, and I'm going to use Dr. Kai's terminology, for the soul here. And I hope that our audience members have really, gained some insight into the issues that our students and our faculty members and staff are dealing with here on campus. And so as we close quickly, I would like for each one of the panelists to say something very quickly to encourage our audience members during this time. Something very quick, a quick sentence that would just give everyone out there listening, a sense of encouragement. What would you say? Michael, let's start with you.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Just give our audience members a quick word of encouragement as we go through this difficult time in our history.
Oh yeah, definitely. The one thing that been lingering on my mind this entire conversation is built an infrastructure for yourself to rely on, right? This sense of holding that can help you stay strong during times like this, and will allow you to remain intact while you're continuing to deal with all the different things that are being released. Because I myself know that I had to take a couple steps back, trying to be in the midst of the fight and constantly trying to have my voice heard, that I lost grasp of my own mental health and my own self. And you really have to, it's funny too that you're the moderator for this, because when we first came to you about MOOC and what we wanted to do, you told me specifically, and this is something that resonated with me, that a house that is divided cannot conquer. And I feel as though that's something that is so important right now. And like, if you think about a house can't stand without an infrastructure. And you need that base and that solid grounding, especially right now, in order to keep this fight up, because your mental health is important as much as it is for to go out there and advocate for change. And you have to really just take care of yourself during this time, and realize the resources that you have, and realize that there are people that are fighting for you that can pick up the slack if you can't necessarily continue to take on the burden yourself, or not the burden, but the activity or whatever it is yourself. So just make use of the people around you. Yeah.
Well, our ancestors actually describe it as a burden, and it is something that we have to carry. And so you encourage being able to take a few steps back. Wilson, what about you? Very quickly, what would you encourage our audience members to do to, during this time of racial turmoil and pandemic as well? What would you encourage our audience members to do, Wilson? Quickly.
Yeah, I'll say let's not stop. Let's ride this momentum all the way. Let's continue, because I feel like the prosecution of a few cops is not what we need. I mean, it's going to heal temporarily, but in the long term, that's not what we're fighting for. So let's continue to sign those petitions. Let's continue to talk. Let's continue to listen. Let's continue to go to the polls. There's power in our voices, and there's power in advocacy. So let's continue, because for social justice and for equity to happen is going to be a long road. And let's continue doing what we're already doing. Thank you.
Let's continue. Marie, what are words of encouragement that you might give our audience members during this time?
First, I would say you're not alone. And second, I would say your joy and self-preservation is equally as important as activism and being out there.
Very good, and very, very concise and succinct too. We like that. All right. Rob, what about you?
Yep. To all my people out there, all Black lives matter. Our Black trans lives matter, Black queers lives, our Black folks with disabilities, all Black lives matter. The global majority, that is the Black and brown populations of the world, are speaking, and the world is listening.
All right, thank you very much. All right, Dr. Kai, you gave us some wonderful advice from a mental health care standpoint on self-care. So what are some parting words that you would give to our audience member as we close out this awesome session?
Yes, so I would say that each of you have been born for such a time as this. Each of you have been born with a purpose, and even a warrior needs rest. So I will hope that even with us understanding the words of I can't breathe, that we will take it even further to understand what we need to do each and every day to breathe in order for us to live, because we don't want to stop with I can't breathe, because that definitely will put us in a position, in a posture where we can feel very immobilized. So my call would be to find out and discover each day what it is that you need in order for you to breathe, in order for you to live, because there is work for us to do.
All right, thank you very much. So on the count of three, I'm going to ask all of our panelists, right, to show our audience members how to breathe. We're going to take a deep breath and we're going to blow it out on the count of three. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. All right. I want to thank you all for such a wonderful conversation that we've had today. I want to thank our audience members for joining us and giving us some really good questions. And so in closing, I would like to do some housekeeping notice items. And as Wilson said, he hopes that we continue these talks. Well, Wilson, guess what? DEI is doing just that. We are continuing conversations because we don't want to let this moment pass, right? And so I want to remind everyone of the next discussion that we're having. The next discussion is speaking truth to power through pedagogy, anti-racist teaching in higher education. And that discussion will occur on Thursday, June 11th at 3 o'clock, right? And I think we have a flyer that we can post on the screen to show, to provide more information on the next one. All right, so we're about to share this there we go, right? And there are panelists. All right, and once again, I want to read it. It is speaking truth to power through pedagogy, anti-racist teaching in higher education. And once again, it occurs on Thursday, June 11th at 3 o'clock p.m. I want you to be committed. I want you to show up, and I want you to take some of this information and share it. Go to the DEI webpage, and we've got all of the critical conversations listed. And we just want to say thank you for joining us during this time. And we also have resources for you on the DEI website that you can share with others, or you can utilize for yourself, and you can put it in your toolkit in order so that you may breathe through this difficult time, and you will have substance for the fight ahead. Once again, I want to thank our panel. I want to thank the Division of DEI for hosting these critical conversations. And I want to wish everyone, please take care of yourselves, because we need you. We need you, we need you, and we can't do this without you. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, panel.